All right, maybe I should get started. What do you think? Yeah? You're saying I was on time? Why do I have to be punished for everyone else that's late? Fair enough. All right, welcome everyone. I'm Jason Maynard. I'm a field CTO for Cisco Canada focused on cybersecurity. This session's all about the cloud and some of the complexities that it introduces. How many people here are using cloud today in their organizations? Okay. How many people are using a single cloud provider? Oh, interesting. So I'm going to challenge that a little bit because I think a lot of organizations start there. And I think CSA called that out earlier today where they talked about, a lot of people start with a single cloud provider. And then sure enough, there's a competitive reason why you might want to move to another, or you want to diversify, cyber resilience. Any of those mechanisms might drive you towards another cloud service provider. And all of a sudden now they have their own security controls. And that's really what we're going to talk about, right? There's the complexity that exists there. All right, so we've got AWS, we've got Azure, we've got GCP, we've got Oracle, and we've got a whole bunch on top of that, right? But those are kind of the main ones. Probably in Canada, Azure and AWS are the primary cloud service providers. Probably Azure leading. I have no preference in either one of them. But we will talk about their specific capabilities at a high level because it's going to highlight some of the complexities as we go along. I can tell you this first and foremost. The cloud service providers are providing security out of the box in comparison to what we've done in the traditional environment. So inherently, they are more secure or have more capabilities that are inherent within their solution stack. So that's a good thing. But as you start building it out, there is some complexities and things that you want to consider. Because over time, what we found is as we're talking to customers, they built in certain controls within a cloud service provider that can't extend, right? And that's where things start getting tough. You've got things like private cloud, right, or your traditional data center. And I've thrown Kubernetes or any container or microservices-based solution kind of off on its stack on its own, even though it could be in the cloud service provider, it could be in your private environment, doesn't really matter, but there's some complexity there as well. And so we're going to go through some of this. We're going to talk about some of the capabilities. I think if you haven't used cloud, some of this is going to be, wow, I can't believe they have all this stuff. And some stuff comes with cost and some things are part of the bundle or package that you get, which is neat. So let's walk through some of this. So we're a single organization today and we're using AWS as our cloud service provider. Again, tremendous capabilities in all of the cloud service providers when it comes to security. So let's talk about some of these controls or capabilities that exist. So AWS has AWS CloudTrail, and what it does is it makes sure that it supports governance and compliance and operational auditing across your AWS accounts. So that's a good thing. Do you do that in your traditional environment? Maybe, maybe not, right? So this is a good thing. Turn it on, continuously monitor across your AWS infrastructure, and you can see things like this, right? An instance being started up and by who? That's probably good information to know, especially if you have hosts that you think aren't accessible, but are accessible by an adversary because they were able to harvest credentials somewhere and logged into an instance. It's going to look like and feel like that user potentially, but maybe there's some nefarious reasons behind it. We don't know yet, right? As we move along, you got Event Bridge. Now, this is serverless event bus capability, but really it's allowing us maybe to take stuff from other security capabilities and drive an event outcome. And if you listen to the earlier session around CSA, where they talked about a couple of things. One is most organizations start with one cloud and they move to multi-cloud, which essentially ends up being a multi-IT environment, right? You got hybrid, on-premise, you got cloud-based infrastructure. And the other thing is, and I don't think we've done a good job here, is the cyber skills set shortage, right? I know everyone says it. It gets a little bit of annoying, right? Because you hear it all the time and you're thinking, why doesn't my paycheck reflect that, right? Right? But at the end of the day, there is a shortage. And you got to think about all these different environments and the skill sets that you require in order to manage these environments. It becomes very, very challenging and expensive. So again, I could now take that event that I got and drive some kind of automated potential response using Event Bridge. And we'll talk a little bit Lambda. Lambda can do some of that stuff as well. You got Amazon Guard Duty, and this is now where I start pulling in logs from CloudTrail, VPC flow logs. If you're familiar with NetFlow or IPFix data, VPC flow logs are similar, right, in the cloud environment, and AWS DNS logs. And so Guard Duty can look for things like recon, account compromise, instance compromise, and bucket compromise. Again, cool stuff. How can you even do that in your own environment? Right? You have to ask yourself that. So these are all good capabilities that they have that you can leverage. Security Hub, comprehensive view of security. It helps you, meet industry standards and best practices. And look at some of the best practices that they call out. Now, you got to remember, every single technology and vendor provides you best practices of everything that you do. And I've only called this out specifically because of the complexity. Imagine all these different disparate technologies, all having their own ways of doing things, having their own best practices, and trying to build the team to support that. I'm not saying forgo the security capability. I'm saying understand the capabilities and where you might need them and how you might achieve it. AWS Firewall. This is pretty cool because I can now manage my WAF in AWS. I can manage my DDoS in AWS, my VPC security groups, my network firewall in AWS, Route 53, and I can also use third-party firewall capabilities here too and manage it. Now, I don't know the extent of the capability and how well they manage third-party, but it is something that's there. And this is a good thing because now you've got one, hopefully, platform that you can manage all these different control points. Amazon Detective. You thought it was done, didn't you? We're still in AWS. Think about GCP. Think about Azure, right? But Amazon Detective, it can extract time-based events, login attempts, API calls, network from AWS CloudTrail and flow logs. Wait, go back. Didn't I say flow logs here earlier too? Oh, Amazon Guard Duty. Explore some behaviors, failed logins, suspicious API key calls. But again, now I'm now using another tool to analyze some of the stuff that I'm already analyzing by another tool, right? But again, it's available to you to leverage. Lambda, again, event-driven outcomes. This is pretty neat because I don't think we do enough of this in the industry as a whole, is having the ability to automate some of the responses. So you see something interesting, potentially nefarious. Can you drive an outcome? Can you make a decision? Can you isolate a host, right? Can you quarantine a host? Can you shut down a port maybe, right? Whatever it might be, you might use something like this to drive that outcome. Again, gathering evidence, eradicate the incident, recover from the incident, and then do post-incident activities. So AWS Lambda is the event portion of this that can drive an outcome. So anyways, it's interesting. Then you have all these logs, right? Security Hub, Guard Duty, Macy, which is around machine learning, AWS Config, Event Bridge, right? And it goes on. What happened? What happened? But anyway, I'll keep going anyway because I don't think it's going to hurt anything. But anyways, now I'm centralizing all that log data, right? The CloudTrail data, the access logs, the DNS logs, and the flow logs from AWS, which is probably a good thing, right? But what about your on-premise environment? How do you get that data in there? Can you do that? I don't know, right? What about Azure? Because I have 2 cloud service providers. How do I get those logs? Do I get them in? And everybody knows here, getting data in is easy. Getting data out is costly, typically, right? So do I even want to do that? And now do I start breaking things up? And data is the new gold, right? Everything's about the data. If you're going to do any kind of mining, it's in data, not gold or oil and gas, right? Hey, yeah, you can call. I'll keep like the most exciting stuff right now, but anyways, so this is a visual of the cloud, right? You can see the cloud, and there's stuff in the cloud. But this is showing you an example of some infrastructure. And so it's showing you the cloud service provider where you have inbound VPC, so the virtual private cloud, right? You've got NAT, you've got maybe IPS and IDS, maybe that's your third party. You've got flow logs, right? Those VPC flow logs or NetFlow or IPFix data, right? If you're trying to translate it across, you've got Route 53, you've got AWS Cloud Shield for DDoS, you've got WAF, all of these guard duty, NACLs that are stateless, and you've got stateful inspection as well. I'll just leave it on this slide just real quick, just so that people in the room can see it. I'm sure everybody online can see it. All right. So do you want me to unplug and plug it back in, the HDMI? Reboot. We don't have time for that. Okay, anyways, it's just a diagram. It's all, you can get this from Amazon. They've done a good job. Even Microsoft, they've all done a good job around security best practices around their cloud service provider. Let's move on, right? You think I'm done with AWS, right? I'm not. AWS IAM, so their Identity Access Manager Analyzer. So looking at S3 buckets and IAM roles and who has access. Are they externally accessible? All those things that are, pretty important if you're putting your data in the cloud. And then you go on to Secrets Manager. This is for passwords, API keys, things like that, where I'm pretty sure API keys are included, but basically where I could put my passwords securely, encrypt them, and programmatically use them as needed. But there's an encrypted channel to get the password or validate the password. And there's a life cycle that supports that. Then you've got AWS Inspector. So I don't know, I've heard guard duty, detective, and inspector, right? You need probably all of them, I'm sure. But this looks at vulnerabilities and, their intended or unintended consequences on the network, resources that might be applied. And then I've got Anonymous that says, wow, a lot of really cool capabilities. Yeah, but who is on Anonymous, right? This is perfect. Cloud Anonymous, it doesn't exist, right? But that's a lot of capabilities, and I'm only touching the surface. Is there anything you guys want me to do, or no? No. So we're yeah, fair enough. Anyways, a lot of capabilities. Again, there's probably tons more. I'm not an AWS guru, right? But these are some of the complexities. Then we got Azure, okay? And I'm not going to do the same thing in the same level of depth. But you have Azure, and there's some differences. As you can see up in the top right corner, top right corner, that you see network security groups. I think AWS just says security groups. And in a network, we call them NetFlow, JFlow, IPFix, right? NSG logs. Sorry, those are controls. My bad. Those are L3, L4 stateful controls. And then you've got NSG logs, which is flow data in the Azure environment, right? Like VPC flow logs and NetFlow. And earlier, if you were in the session where they're talking about IoT and things that happen in that XIoT environment, and how would you know? Well, you should probably be baselining your network so you know when there's communications that's happening. You don't need to find out that your power bill's $1 billion because your traffic in the network should be an indicator that something nefarious is happening, right? There's got to be a communication channel to make that magic happen on those cameras. And if you have a baseline of the environment, you can look for anomalies. So that's why flow logs are critically important. So Microsoft, there's been some name changes, right? It's Defender for the Cloud or Defender for Everything. Again, a lot of great capabilities. They've got the Security Center that gives you a good idea of where you sit in regards to security and opportunity there. You have Monitor, where now we're looking at activity logs and resource logs, and we've got some automation that supports that. Again, data is the new gold, right? Tremendously valuable, especially in incident response. Then you have Azure Advisor. Now, we all can use an advisor. And so, why not have a consultant that can help you better leverage the resources that you have and reduce cost and increase security and optimize and all those good things. Again, another tool. And then you've got, Azure Sentinel. I think that's Defender. I don't know, but no, it's not, just still the same. Yeah. So anyways, they've got some orchestration and automation and playbook running. with that as well. Again, all cool stuff that you can certainly leverage. And this is an example of a playbook, right? And a playbook, for those that aren't aware, is something that maybe an event that takes place, and based on that event, we want actions, right? So if it is bad, then I may want to do a triage of some sort, maybe send a sample to a sandbox, detonate it, get the results, and share it to my analyst. I don't want my analyst to have to manually go and do that, right? And then if it comes back as a disposition of bad, electrocute the person on the key. No, that's a feature release, the future. But do something like block the account or add a firewall rule in the next gen platform somewhere, right? And then this is what I was showing earlier on the Azure side. Very similar. You've got the security groups. You've got NACLs, right? L3, L4 based controls. You got web application firewalls, Defender, DDoS, Azure firewall, Azure MFA. Right? A lot of stuff, right? So that's just 2 cloud providers, right? How do you become proficient in all of those different disparate capabilities, right? They all do their things differently. And we haven't forgot about the traditional data center that you've been managing and supporting and securing forever, right? Where do those skill sets go? Do they just get tossed out the window? So, yeah, it becomes tough, right? Because you've got probably a fairly decent or mature practice within your traditional environment, and now you're plugging in and extending into these cloud service providers and maybe turning these things on. What's happening is customers are coming back and saying, this is crazy. Like I'm having some challenges here, right? I can't, the stuff I'm doing in AWS or Azure, it doesn't do anything to help me on the on-prem. So now I'm managing these all disparately. And do they come back and start talking to each other? That's a whole other problem that I have, right? And every time they change stuff in their infrastructure, it impacts us. And, the complexity just continues to get added. And forget about, we haven't even really talked about containers. We haven't talked about SaaS-based services. What about the work-from-home user, right? There's a ton of things on the security space, and we haven't even talked about the operational environment. So you can see all kinds of stuff here, right? Next-gen firewall, flow log, SIM, NAC. These are all things in a traditional environment that still exist. They're not going away. And in some cases, anytime soon, right? We're talking years, especially in large enterprises and government institutions. We're talking a long, long time before this stuff starts to be cloud only or cloud native 100% of everything we do. So again, from an adversarial perspective, they have the advantage here, right? The more complexity we add within the security space, the more advantage the adversary has, even if it's for good, apparently, right? No judgment here. So let's go through a little bit of a scenario. This is really going to start putting it into perspective, right? You've got work from home, work from anywhere, branch office, main office, right? These are all things that exist today. The hybrid work, that's not going anywhere. You've got public cloud, private cloud, and internet, right? That exists. You've got your SaaS-based services. Obviously, the channel between internet and SaaS is typically there. You've got private and public cloud access. And then you've got, I picked the 3 main players, right? Google, Azure, and AWS. And I might be wrong, but it doesn't really matter. You've got threat intelligence. Everybody here that's defending networks got to think about that, right? Or environments got to think about threat intelligence and how does this work across the entire ecosystem of capabilities. And then you've got detection, response, orchestration, automation, right? If you can automate and orchestrate within the cloud service provider and you can't in the on-premise environment, you still got a big gap, right? You've still got a challenge here. So let's walk through some of the capabilities. So you got endpoint protection, endpoint detection and response on the endpoint, right? These are almost these are staples. You can't get away with securing an environment without EPP or EDR, right? Endpoint detection and response, advanced malware protection, sandboxing, all of that stuff, right? And you're going to have that on your work from home, work from anywhere, branch office, the main office, on all those endpoints. You're going to have it in your private cloud infrastructure, and you're going to have it in your workloads if they support it in the cloud, right? That makes sense. You're also going to have DNS, zero trust network access, right? Zero trust earlier. We heard this with CSA. It's not a product. I don't know if they said this, but I think that's where they were going. It's not a product, right? It's a framework. an initiative that you're driving towards. There's probably no end state ever. It's not a single vendor that provides the entire ecosystem that gives you zero trust. But zero trust network access is one component that drives towards zero trust. Cloud delivered firewall, intrusion prevention, data loss prevention, remote browser isolation. So this is the ability to be able to have the browser delivered in the cloud and for high targeted individuals, maybe C-suite, IT, security ops, right? Financial controllers. You may not want that browser to ever be rendered on that endpoint. Why? Well, because if an adversary is able to run an exploit kit against it and find a vulnerability and expose it, they're on the asset. But if I render the browser in the cloud and the underlying operating system's hardened, and if it gets compromised, it's never that asset. So that's what remote browser isolation is for those that may or may not know. Next-gen firewall. Again, I'm not a big fan of this. I've said this in every single talk, next gen, next gen, next gen. Problem I'm not a fan of it is because what does next gen never do? Expire. So, right, it never expires. So if I build a next gen firewall and do nothing with it for 5 years and still have that label there, it's still next gen, right? And you're going to look at it, right? Because you're looking at the market. And now you'll probably figure it out very quickly. It's not. And you can't say next gen firewall or next gen firewall version 2. So I'm not a fan of it, but marketing needs it. And so it's there. Because if I would have just said firewall, somebody would have said, what about next gen firewall, right? You know you would have, right? But again, you're going to have that at your branch office, your main office. You're going to have it in a private cloud. You're going to have it in each one of your cloud service providers as well, providing some of that advanced functionality, right, that you can drive through next-gen capabilities. Cyber asset and attack surface management and cloud security posture management. So having the ability to not only make sure that you're compliant to certain compliance regulations that you might be driving towards within the cloud infrastructure, but also making sure that you have a security posture that you're proud of, right? And that you're meeting the goals of the organization. Vulnerability and risk, right? So risk-based vulnerability management, having the ability to understand the risks of the vulnerabilities in regards to whether or not I need to prioritize this vulnerability that's a 10 versus this 10 versus this 9.8 versus this 9.9, right? That's the biggest challenge for anybody. But again, are you doing that in AWS with their tools? Can it extend? Maybe. I don't know. That's, you guys need to figure that out. I'm not here to figure that piece out. But those are things you got to think about, right? When you start turning it on, are you getting the same level of richness and capability that independent products might provide? Maybe, maybe not, right? Can you extend it to that user that's sitting at a coffee shop that's connecting that you want to do a vulnerability scan against? Does it correlate the data, or do I have disparate, data sources that I got to parse from? Secure workload. So the ability to take the workload and build host-based or application-based microsegmentation within those workloads. So whether you're Kubernetes, whether you're a Docker or container instance that's running, do I build controls within that environment to make sure that within the system and the communication between them is the communication I want? And as it leaves the host itself, am I controlling that as well, right? And so there's some challenges there. And again, are you using something that might be inherently available to you in that cloud service provider? Can it extend to the other one? I think very quickly you can start seeing that this is becoming a mess, right? Easily becoming a mess. Secure application, this is where we get into DevOps, CI/CD, the pipeline, and making sure that we're securing application code before it's being introduced to an environment. I need a break. Okay, remote access VPN. That still exists. You can go zero trust network access all day, every day. And that's going to provide maybe 80 to 90% of the use cases. And what that basically is giving you the flexibility to access applications using native TLS, as opposed to running it in a VPN tunnel to run TLS in that tunnel to access the application. And then you get into things like, device posture, the health, the identity of the individual, right? So that all gets part of that package. remote access VPN is still required in some use cases, right? Too. So main office to branch office, to private cloud to public cloud, you're going to direct connect, express route. You're going to have all of these connectivities that you're going to have to consider security, the security wrapper that you're going to put around it. CASB, right? Cloud Access Security Broker. So I want to make sure that the sanctioned applications that are delivering to my users are actually have DLP and policy, and I understand that. So those are things. And then you got shadow IT, right? You want to understand what cloud applications are being used in the organization as a whole, right? Malware in the cloud. So you might have endpoint protection, and you might say, well, look at, why do I need some of these things? I've got endpoint protection. It's going to mitigate risk, right? I mean, it has a malware component to it. I can tell you this, right? If you're waiting to protect at the endpoint, good luck, because you better be right 100% of the time. 100% of the time. Because if you're wrong, guess what? They're already there. They're on that asset. You want to push your controls as far away from the asset you're protecting as possible, but you can't rely on those 100%, and that's why you need endpoint protection. But that's the last source of the truth, right? You want to make sure that you're blocking here. So malware in the cloud is having the ability to scan the file repositories in those cloud environments using APIs, as an example. So Box would be one of those examples. Email security. What's the #1 vector right now for threats? Yeah, right? Email. Right? It all translate because get connected now. So wherever you've got that gap, that's the channel to move into that organization. Network detection and response. I mentioned flow logs. Well, you need to analyze those flow logs. A couple of things that I think, in my opinion, every organization file, regardless of the technology, ideally should be in one central location. Anything I need to detonate in a sandbox and figure out its disposition, I want to be able to collect it in one place. DNS logs, whether you're off-premise, on-premise, IoT, in the cloud service provider, I want those centrally located. And the other one is I should be able to collect flow data regardless of it, whether you're at the coffee shop using IPFix as an example, whether you're in the cloud service provider using NSG or VPC flow logs, or you're using NetFlow, JFlow, SFlow within the organization. I want that in a central location because those are all critically important in incident response. And if you have to jump around to multiple different tools to try to pull it together, I feel you, right? But that exists. So network detection and response is really baselining the environment, understanding how the environment works normally, and then from there, look for deviation. Some of that could be signature-based. Some of that might be machine learning over time. But you want to be able to trigger, for example, very simple use case, a layer 2 network gets compromised, WannaCry. We don't know what it is today, right? Let's assume WannaCry 2. It starts doing SMB 445 probes from one asset to all the assets in here because we're one layer 2 network. How long does it take for you to see that? Or do you? Do you ever even see that, right? Are you waiting for an L3 control to be able to look at that? Well, it's too late because you might have lost an entire segment. Multi-factor authentication. Now this is I think it's saying, get out. Multi-factor authentication. So again, like, some MFAs are going to provide you functionality, but some of the things you got to think about, because we want to move towards passwordless, we want that multi-factor authentication component, but you got to think about RDP and SSH and some of the other applications that are out there that you probably should be doing MFA on. And again, if you have multiple MFA, which is very common, even in Western Canada, you have multiple MFA platforms, it's challenging for the user, right? And then, we're seeing that constant push, go ahead, push, you're going to push, right? I keep sending it to you to say, okay, fine, I want this. So, and then you got on the campus side, 802.1x, you start getting into guest access, but you want to drive some zero trust outcomes. but also think about zero trust, right? So making sure your posture profile authenticate the asset before it gets on the network. Once it gets on the network, you can find it, right? Dynamic controls should be pushed on that particular asset. DDoS and web application. So it's getting hard to solve. So if you're using DDoS from vendor A, vendor B, and then you've got your own enterprise DDoS internally, again, you're breaking kind of the analysis that you could do. And then and again, you might how do I consume threat intelligence? Do I cover detect, prevent, and response capabilities? How do I hunt for threats? What about orchestration automation? Can I build playbooks? What about incident response? Everyone does it different, right? How do I become proficient? And do I really understand the attack surface? So this is the challenge as defenders, right? So how many people here on the blue side? Everyone? No? On the red side? So look, you got a lot of opportunity, right? So get busy. Get busy. No. But there's a ton of opportunity for you. The blue side has a heck of a problem, right? Trying to defend and mitigate risk here. And so if we go through an example, I thought, you know what, let's make a simple example and think about this in your own environments. How hard would this be? And this is going to be a very simple example, okay? You have AWS, it doesn't matter the cloud service provider, and you're using guard duty, right? So there's some intelligence there that's going to help pick up flow data, right? You have the adversary. The adversary is knocking on the front door, right? Like, I don't know quite like that, but that's the best I got. But they're knocking on the front door, and they're trying to get in, right? So they're hitting that whatever they're to control. And there could be just a simple block, right? And how many people here go through every one of the blocks that they have on a device? And if you do, that's incredible, but nobody cares, right? Executives don't care how much you block, right? You can pound your chest all day and say, look at how much I block. Nobody cares. When you get breached, though, that's when they care. So, okay, so that happens. And then you've got a traditional data center. They've done some reconnaissance out of band. They figured out the IP of your traditional data center environment. We've got a VPN between them. We've got that flow collector. It's not part of that, that AWS collector that's happening. And they knock on that front door, right? Maybe that's the internet gateway on its way into the data center. Maybe it's a DMZ. It doesn't really matter. You get the idea, right? They're knocking on the door. Can you tie the two together? I'm going to say you probably can't, right? You might by source IP, maybe, if he hasn't or her changed the IP address. But most likely they're proxying and they're fluctuating. And so that's probably not going to be a good way of figuring out somebody's knocking. And all of a sudden an EC2 instance gets started. So a bastion host of some sort, get started in the environment, and now they have access into that environment. They actually bypassed that gateway, right? They're coming in through the management plane, right? They're not coming through the data plane. And so now they have access into that environment. They go to a public subnet, they pivot, move laterally into the private subnet, and then they discover some direct connect VPN type connectivity. And so you might get VPC logs here, and you might even get an alert. But I guarantee you, depends on the technology stack that you have, you're getting alerts all over the place already. So do you see this one, and how valuable is it in comparison to all the other ones that are there? So most likely this will get just missed, right? Even though everybody here does a phenomenal job. Just can't. You can't look at everything. And so then the adversary starts moving laterally within that environment, and maybe there's a service farm of some sort. They get access, they land on a box, they do some privilege escalation. And again, every one of your technologies hopefully are going ding, 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 maybe preventing in certain areas to let you know. But let's just keep it simple. Flow logs are being generated, and it gets sent to your flow collector. I'm just going to ask this question. How many people are doing flow collection? If you don't want, yeah, I guess if you're doing it, you're going to put your hands up, and then the others are going to say, I'm not going to respond. But many people don't. I can tell you that, right? But anyways, the adversary continues to move, and then you might have another cloud service provider in this case, and you have another services farm of assets in that environment. And again, NSG, and it gets sent to Network Watcher. So, I mean, best case scenario is I've captured every single event, right? The hard piece is now pulling it all together and knowing that they're actually part of the same thing. That's the biggest challenge in all of this. And so what happens is that I get some alerts in AWS as an example. The EC2 instance started, a VPC log. And then on-premise, we've got flow logs and NSG logs. And this is essentially what ends up happening, right? This is painful for anybody. The human portion of what we do, right, is very, very painful. And so, and think about this. A lot of the services that we have are just in time, right? Micro-based services that scale out as capacity is needed, and they shrink it. If I can get in there and move somewhere and get out as you disappear, you may never know I was there. You may never know how I got into the environment. These just-in-time services makes it very, very tough for us. So the adversary is liking this because complexity, as I mentioned, is the enemy of security. There's no doubt about it. The industry before cloud was always saying around fragmentation and all the different technologies. If you ask anybody in network, name 10 vendors in the networking space, they might be able to do it. Ask them 15, they probably can't. Same thing with systems, same thing with storage. And I'm talking someone that lives and breathes that space. If I go into security room and ask somebody about naming every single vendor in that space, not a chance, right? And in fact, I've done this once, and I'll never do it again because I know I embarrassed somebody. But I made up this product. I said, look, have you heard about, and I said about this, can you name any vendor, blah, blah, blah. And then I went in and I said, there's an endpoint product. It's called Security Ninja. It does some really cool stuff around dispositions and sandboxing. And I said, who in the room has heard of it? And somebody put their hand up, right? Now, and I said, now how do I handle that? I was hoping nobody would put their hand up. But in fact, somebody put their hand up. Now, they could be right, and I didn't know that existed. But I think... they were kind of, yeah. So anyways, it's never good to do that because I think I embarrassed the individual. So I don't ask that question anymore because someone might just say they want to be eager and say, yes, I've heard of it. Yeah. Have you used it? Yes. No, you didn't, because I made it up. Yeah. So there's so many vendors in the space. So we haven't made it easy. And cloud, again, just adds to the complexity. Hybrid work adds to the complexity. Okay, so what do you want to do in this situation? Anybody have any thoughts or ideas around this? Anyone? No? Quiet? Lunch? You had the butter tart, right? Was that for lunch? I saw the butter tart there. I had it too. So after this, I'm done. But anyways, so what you want to do, ideally, is take a step back. I'm not saying turn off your controls. Keep your controls there. But I would take a step back and understand the use cases. understand the use cases, and walk through each one. Consumer browser to e-commerce, application workloads to update servers, front-end web servers to back-end e-commerce, right? Application engine to database zone, right? DevOps to management zone. And when you take a step back and look at it from that lens, now what you do is think about the executive drivers of the organizations, the threats and risks to the business, and you start building this out as if you're adding your defensive capability. Forget budget, forget about the team that's going to support it. Don't have those in as complexity, because what you want to do is push this to your leadership team, or your team push it to you, and have them tell you what they believe is required in order to secure that. Now you can see there's not a cloud vendor on this side. There's not a traditional network. Now you could put that. You could actually pivot off of each one of these and say, you know, AWS, Azure, traditional data center, right? And just maybe because there's some differences in some of the things that you might want to do there. But the point being is that now that I do that, I can now start analyzing what are some of the things that I want to do. You know, untrusted user, DDoS attack, web, and these aren't comprehensive. It's just a simple example. Web vulnerabilities, network breach, advanced threats, malware, infection. These are all things I'm concerned about. And then what you want to do is put on that red team hat, right? That red team hat, or have red team and blue team and, you know, network and the system owners all in the same room. And what you want to do is challenge this. I'm not saying hack it, but think like a hacker, right? How do I compromise this environment and get a foothold? Or think like an auditor, right? That's another way of thinking about it. But now what you do is say, well, wait a minute. What if, and if that outcome is true, are we at risk? Yes. What does that mean? Yeah. Okay. What control do we need here in order to mitigate that? So as you go through each one of these and start figuring out all the little controls that you need and validate this, as many of the use cases as you can do, now I can talk about the controls I need. Not product, not the vendor, right? Now, internally, if you're doing this yourself, then you could put your vendor, right? I mean, you've got a relationship there, and maybe you say this is covered by this vendor, right? So you can highlight it. But the bottom line is this is capability driven, not product manufacturer driven. And then you determine that outcome. So you can see things like DDoS anomaly detection, threat visibility, vulnerability management, anti-malware. You might have SIM, threat correlation. All of that stuff might exist here, right? Those are all critical components in order for you to feel confident that you have the right controls in place. That doesn't mean you're 100% protected. What it means is that you put in the best position. Once you do that, it's somebody else's problem to figure out the budget and the team to support it. But at least they can't say you missed it, right? You've went through this systematically and tore it apart. You do that for each one of the flows. I don't know why I'm showing that twice. And then what you want to do, ideally, is say, I need DNS and web, and I use a technology stack that can cover it across all of the environments that I'm going to support, future or otherwise, right? Firewalling, IPS, VPN, they tend to go together, right? Malware. Can I do that across all of my different environments? Flow analytics, right? Can I take NSG logs, flow logs, VPC logs, multi-factor authentication, application segmentation, right? Endpoint EPP and EDR, DDoS and web application firewall. There's some synergies there, but this just gives you an idea. Now I can build this out and not have to worry about having somebody that's proficient in all the different firewall technologies and vendors that I could possibly use. I've now got a strategy to make sure that I'm maximizing and making sure the people that are supporting those technologies are proficient. Because remember the sandwich layer with the firewalls? And I don't know if this may or may not be true because I can't remember. That's how long ago it was. But I believe there was a study at one point to say, is 2 different vendors better than 1 vendor in that scenario? Does anybody want to take a guess? What do you think? 2 different vendors? Because if there's a vulnerability in one, there might not be in another, and therefore there'd be layers. That used to be the way. But the industry's gotten way better at vulnerability management, especially when you're talking security devices and things like that. And in fact, a single vendor is better. And why? It doesn't matter the vendor, but why is it better? What? Less complexity, you become proficient. Say you're the firewall person, they're an expert. They don't need to figure out the new feature coming out on another firewall and how they do and execute things that are a little bit different than this one. Making sure you maintain vulnerabilities, right? You keep that up to date. Or you have a sandwich layer as well, but same vendor. Then you've got risk-based vulnerability assessment and mitigation. And then each one of these, because I didn't want to leave you guys without the details, is that you would actually go through each one of these technologies, because you would have a requirement in your organization. And you would say, you know what, for endpoint detection response, things I'd like to see in a product, you may or may not get them all in one product, but that's the goal. I want, malicious activity protection. Malicious activity protection, right? I want to be able to see a drive get encrypted and then, stop the encryption as soon as possible. Maybe I lose 1 or 2 files, but I haven't lost the system. And then you're going to go a little bit further where you have extended detection and response. So a lot of people are looking at EDR, focused on EDR. EDR is great, but what's the problem with EDR? So only as good as the assets installed on. I think earlier the ex-IoT individual said there was something like 50 billion IoT devices that are out there, right? How many have endpoint agents installed on them? None, right? So that's why you want to go beyond. I'm not saying EDR is bad. I'm saying it's great, but it's only as good as the endpoint it's on. You've got flow data, use it. Your endpoint, your proxy logs, all of that now needs to be understood so you can build in mitigating controls. Orchestration, automation, and playbooks, critically important. All right, I've got 2 minutes left, even with all of these up and down, but I think I got the message across. It's complex. It really, really is. Just don't get caught with this multi-cloud environment without thinking about this, because at the end of the day, if you were at Michael's talk earlier about stress, that's what you're going to get, right? A ton of that and a ton of complexity, and most likely we'll get a breach, and then they're going to come to you and say, what happened? Well, I'm blocking 50,000 events every day. Yeah, well, this one got in, and that's the one I care about, right? So lots of great security capabilities provided by that cloud service provider, but think about how that applies to the entire picture. Securing cloud can get complex very, very quickly. I think I've shown that. Understanding that executive drivers, threats and risks to the business, and the business flows to determine what are the actual mitigating controls I need in my environment. And then build-in cloud security may be limited and will introduce fragmentation. So it's not a knock. I want to make that very, very clear. It's not a knock against the cloud service provider. But when you're doing or looking at a specific control within that cloud service provider, I would encourage you to go to market to see about what does that capability look like, in that environment from a more agnostic lens. And then how do I apply that to all the other environments that I do support? API-driven programmatic outcomes, huge, right? It's funny. I remember back in the day, you had the CLI. We were all awesome, right? The CLI. And then they had the GUI, and people would say, why don't you have a GUI? Like, you should have a GUI. We should be able to click, 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 drag, drop, right? Everything's great. And then they said, well, I want to programmatically make changes. I need an API, right? And I'm thinking, okay, well, is that just not an advanced CLI? Like, have we come full circle? You give them the GUI, and now we've got an API that's being written like this to drive outcomes through automation. So anyways, I find it a little bit comical. Consider all aspects of detection, prevention, and response, right? And everything you do on the security side, I don't care about how much the product can say it blocks. At the end of the day, one will get in. So how does that tool help my team understand how it got in and where it went and what it's done? Because that's the part that's going to be most important. Participation from all teams. So if you're going to do this, bring in network security, cloud, audit. I've done this myself with folks, and I've seen even procurement in the room in public sector as an example. And all of a sudden they say, well, wait a minute, we should think about the way we buy product now. We didn't understand that all of these things really do matter. And there's value in some of that. Networking, endpoint, they all have value to add around where that risk profile exists on every one of those assets. And yeah, so maybe they're not liking this guy. anymore. Maybe finally the defenders may have a little bit of an opportunity right here to come out on top here. But that's it. Any comments, questions, feedback? Any BS? You think how much BS? No. Anything? No.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
There is a security run at cost.
The what? Is there? Did you look?
Yes, I did.
You did. So there is a test at the end of this. And I hope you weren't looking at that time. No. So maybe there was, right? But is it endpoint?
No, it's for WordPress.
Okay. Well, I did specify endpoint.
They call secure firewall, secure malware scanner. So
Yeah. But anyways, that my lesson there was never do that again, right? That was my lesson. Anyways, guys, have a great rest of the 2 days. Appreciate it.